Hello and welcome. This module is a two-part series that explains the basic infrastructure components of Microsoft Azure. You'll learn about the physical infrastructure and management of resources. In part one, we covered Azure, accounts, and completed an interactive lab using the Microsoft Learn Sandbox. In this lesson, we'll cover architecture and resource crafting. The goal of this video is to narrate the Microsoft Learn content, demystify these concepts, add additional information when needed, making concepts easier to comprehend. You can follow along on the Microsoft Learn page. A triangle with MS in the center shows the page number for the Microsoft Learn unit. This video starts on Unit 5. Throughout your journey with Microsoft Azure, you'll hear and use terms like regions, availability zones, resources, subscriptions, and more. This module focuses on the core architectural components of Azure. The core architectural components of Azure may be broken down into two main groupings: the physical infrastructure and the management infrastructure. The physical infrastructure for Azure starts with data centers. Conceptually, the data centers are the same as a large corporate data center. They're facilities with resources arranged in racks with dedicated power, cooling, and network infrastructure. As a global cloud provider, Azure has data centers around the world. However, these individual data centers aren't directly accessible. Data centers are grouped into Azure Regions, or Azure Availability Zones, that are designed to help you achieve resiliency and reliability for your business-critical workloads. The Global Infrastructure site gives you a chance to interactively explore the underlying Azure infrastructure. A region is a geographical area on the planet that contains at least one, but potentially multiple data centers that are nearby and networked together with a low-latency network. Azure intelligently assigns and controls the resources within each region to ensure workloads are appropriately balanced. When you deploy a resource in Azure, you'll often need to choose the region where you want your resource deployed. Some services or virtual machines, VMs, features are only available in certain regions, such as specific VM sizes or storage types. There are also some global Azure services that don't require you to select a particular region, such as Azure Active Directory, Azure Traffic Manager, and Azure DNS. Availability zones are physically separated data centers within each region. Each availability zone is made up of one or more data centers equipped with independent cooling, power, and networking. An availability zone is set up to be an isolation boundary. If one zone goes down, the other continues working. Availability zones are connected through high-speed private fiber optic networks. You want to ensure your services and data are redundant so you can protect your information in case of failure. When you host your infrastructure, setting up your redundancy requires that you create duplicate hardware environments. Azure can help make your apps highly available through availability zones. You can use availability zones to run mission-critical applications and build high availability into your application architecture by co-locating your compute, storage, networking, and data resources within an availability zone and replicating in other availability zones. Keep in mind that there could be a cost to duplicating your services and transferring data between availability zones. Availability zones are primarily for virtual machines, managed disks, load balancers, and SQL databases. Azure services that support availability zones fall into three categories: zone services, zone redundant services, non-regional services. Zone services. You pin the resource to a specific zone, for example, VMs, managed disks, IP addresses. Zone redundant services. The platform replicates automatically across zones, for example, zone redundant storage, SQL database, and so on. Non-regional services. Services are always available from Azure geographies and are resilient to zone-wide outages as well as region-wide outages. Even with the additional resiliency that availability zones provide, it's possible that an event could be so large that it impacts multiple availability zones in a single region. To provide even further resilience, Azure has region pairs. Most Azure regions are paired with another region within the same geography, such as US Europe or Asia. These region pairs are at least 300 miles away. This approach allows for the replication of resources across a geography that helps reduce the likelihood of interruptions because of events such as natural disasters, civil unrest, power outages, or physical network outages that affect an entire region. For example, if a region in a pair was affected by a natural disaster, services would automatically fail over to the other region in the region pair. Not all Azure services automatically replicate data or automatically fail back from a failed region to cross-replicate to another enabled region. In these scenarios, recovery and replication must be configured by the customer. Advantages of region pairs. If an extensive Azure outage occurs, one region out of every pair is prioritized to make sure at least one is restored as quickly as possible for applications hosted in that region pair. Planned Azure updates are rolled out to paired regions, one region at a time to minimize downtime and risk of application outage. Data continues to reside within the same geography as its pair, except for Brazil South, for tax and law enforcement jurisdiction purposes. Most regions are paired in two directions, meaning they're a backup for the region that provides a backup for them. West US and East US back each other up. However, some regions, such as West India and Brazil South, are paired in only one direction. In a one-direction pairing, the primary region does not provide backup for its secondary region. So even though West India's secondary region is South India does not rely on West India. West India's secondary region is South India, but South India's secondary region is Central India. Brazil South is unique because it's paired with a region outside of its geography. Brazil South's secondary region is South Central US. The secondary region of South Central US isn't Brazil South. In addition to regular regions, Azure also has sovereign regions. Sovereign regions are instances of Azure that are isolated from the main instance of Azure. You may need to use the sovereign regions for compliance or legal purposes. Azure sovereign regions include US DoD Central, US Government Virginia, US Government Iowa, and more. These regions are physically and logically network isolated instances of Azure for US government agencies and partners. These data centers are operated and screened by US personnel and include additional compliance certifications. China East, China North, and more. These regions are available through a unique partnership between Microsoft and 21 Bayonet, where Microsoft doesn't directly maintain the data centers. In the following few slides, we will discuss the components of Azure Management Infrastructure. The management infrastructure includes Azure resources and resource groups, subscriptions, and accounts. Understanding that the hierarchical organization will help you plan your projects and products within Azure. Azure resources and resource groups. A resource is the basic building block of Azure. Anything you create, provision, deploy, etc. is a resource. Virtual machines, virtual networks, databases, cognitive services, they're all considered resources within Azure. Resource groups are simply a grouping of resources. When you create a resource, you must place it into a resource group. While a resource group can contain many resources, a single resource can only be in one resource group at a time. Some resources may be moved between resource groups, but when you move a resource to a new group, it will no longer be associated with the former group. Additionally, resource groups can't be nested, meaning you can't put resource group B inside resource group A. Resource groups provide a convenient way to group resources together. When you apply an action to a resource group, that action will apply to all the resources within the resource group. If you delete a resource group, all the resources will be deleted. If you grant or deny access to a resource group, you've granted or denied access to all of the resources within the resource group. When providing resources, it's good to think about the resource group structure that best suits your needs. For example, suppose you're setting up a temporary dev environment. In that case, grouping all the resources means you can deprovision all associated resources at once by deleting the resource group. If you're provisioning compute resources that will need 3 different access schemas, in that case, grouping resources based on access schema may be best, and then assigning access level at the resource group level. There aren't complex rules about how you use resource groups, so consider how to set up your resource groups to maximize their usefulness for you. In Azure, subscriptions are a management, billing, and scale units. Similar to how resource groups are a way to organize resources logically, subscriptions allow you to organize your resource groups and facilitate billing logically. Using Azure requires an Azure subscription. A subscription provides authenticated and authorized access to Azure products and services. It also allows you to provision resources. An Azure subscription links to an Azure account, an identity in Azure Active Directory, or a directory that Azure AD trusts. An account can have multiple subscriptions, but only one is required. In a multiple subscription account, you can use the subscriptions to configure different billing models and apply different access management policies. You can use Azure subscriptions to define boundaries around Azure products services, and resources. There are two types of subscription boundaries that you can use: a billing boundary and access control boundary. In a billing boundary, the subscription type determines how Azure accounts are billed for using Azure. You can create multiple subscriptions for different types of billing requirements. Azure generates separate billing reports and invoices for each subscription so that you can organize and manage costs. With access control boundary, Azure applies access management policies at the subscription level, and you can create separate subscriptions to reflect different organizational structures. An example is that within a business, you have different departments to which you apply distinct Azure subscription policies. The billing model allows you to manage and control access to user-provisioned resources within specific subscriptions. Similar to using resource groups to separate resources by function or access, you might want to create additional subscriptions for resource and billing management purposes. For example, you might choose to create an additional subscriptions to separate environments, organizational structure, billing, and security. With environments, you can create a subscription to set up separate environments for development and testing security, or to isolate data for compliance reasons. This design is beneficial because resource access control occurs at the subscription level. Organizational structures. You can create subscriptions to reflect different organizational structures. For example, you can limit one team to lower cost resources, while allowing the IT department a full range. This design allows you to manage and control access to the resources that users provision within each subscription. With billing, you can create additional subscriptions for billing purposes. Because costs are first aggregated at the subscription level, you might want to create subscriptions to manage and track costs based on your needs. For instance, you might want to create one subscription for your production workloads and another for your development and testing workloads. In security, creating additional Azure subscriptions for security purposes provides isolation, control, compliance, and cost savings. It ensures that each subscription is separate from others, reducing the attack surface and limiting damage in case of a breach. Independent management allows for precise control over resource and costs, and separate subscriptions for sensitive workloads aid compliance adherence. Allocating specific resources for security can optimize costs. The final piece is the management group. Resources are gathered into resource groups, and resource groups are gathered into subscriptions. If you're just starting in Azure, that might seem like enough hierarchy to keep things organized. But imagine if you're dealing with multiple applications, multiple development teams, and multiple geographies. If you have many subscriptions, you might need a way of efficiently managing access, policies, and compliance for those subscriptions. Azure Management Groups provides a level of scope above subscriptions. You can organize subscriptions into containers called management groups and apply governance conditions to the management groups. All subscriptions within a management group automatically inherit the conditions applied to the management group. The same way the resource groups inherit settings from subscriptions and resources inherit from resource groups. Management groups give you enterprise-grade management at large scale, no matter what type of subscriptions you might have. Management groups can be nested. You can build a flexible structure of management groups and subscriptions to organize your resources into a hierarchy for unified policy access management. The following diagram shows an example for creating a hierarchy for governance by using management groups. Some examples of how you could use management groups might be: create a hierarchy that applies a policy. You can limit your virtual machine locations to the US West region in a production group. The policy will inherit all the subscriptions that are descendants of the management group and apply to all the VMs under those subscriptions. The resource or subscription owner can't alter the security policy, which allows for improved governance. Providing user access to multiple subscriptions, moving multiple subscriptions under a management group allows you to create an Azure role-based access control, also known as Azure RBAC assignment. Assigning the Azure RBAC at the management group level means all sub-management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, and resources underneath that management group would also inherit permissions. One assignment of the management group can enable users to access everything they need instead of scripting Azure RBAC over different subscriptions. Essential facts about management groups. 10,000 management groups can be supported in a single directory. A management group tree can support up to 6 levels of depth. The limit doesn't include the root level or the subscription level. The statement, each management group and subscription can support only one parent, means that within Azure, a management group or subscription can have only one parent entity. In other words, a management group or subscription can be organized under a single parent for hierarchy management and administrative purposes. This structure ensures clear ownership and simplifies management within the Azure resource hierarchy. Now let's create an Azure resource in Azure Sandbox. Activate the Sandbox. Click Activate Sandbox. Review permissions if required. Accept the permissions. The Sandbox will verify permissions, create resources, and assign roles. Azure will configure the Cloud Shell for Sandbox access. If you receive a sad face on the connection or the connection is reset, refresh your page or navigate to the Sandbox in the Azure portal. Task 1. Create a virtual machine. Sign into the Azure portal. Select Create a Resource, Compute, Virtual Machine, and Create. The direction says VM by typing Computer. The compute is not an option. Type virtual machine to go directly to the virtual machine service and select Create. The Create a Virtual Machine pane opens on the Basics tab. Use the information listed under the Basic tab to complete the item for each setting. If a setting isn't specified, leave the default value. Type myVM-VM under the virtual machine name. Next, add a password. The password complexity requires a lowercase letter, an uppercase letter, a number, and a unique character like a $sign. Change public ports to none. Click Review and Create. Select Create. On the screen, you can see that the portal is creating the Ubuntu virtual machine. Task 2. Verify resources created. Click Home. Select Resource Groups. Choose the Learn2F resource groups. You should see a list of resources in the resource groups. The storage account and virtual network are associated with the Learn Sandbox. Azure gave them all a similar name to help with association, group them into the same resource groups. Congratulations! You've created a resource in Azure and saw how resources get grouped on creation. Cleanup. The Sandbox automatically cleans up your resources after finishing the module. When working on your subscription, it's a good idea at the end of a project to identify whether you still need the resources you created. Resources that you leave running can cost you money. You can delete resources individually or resource groups to delete the entire set of resources. If you're following along, sign into the Microsoft Learn using their Microsoft account and get experience points as you complete the knowledge check. In this module, you learned about the physical and management structure of Microsoft Azure. You were introduced to the relationship between data centers, availability zones, and regions. You explored how the infrastructure supports the benefits of the cloud, such as high availability and reliability. You also learned about the management infrastructure of Azure. You explored how resources and resource groups are related, and how subscriptions and management groups can help manage resources.